Hello and welcome back to 60 Minutes. Today's story is an interview with a war veteran. Darcy Stone reports. Thanks Amanda for that wonderful introduction. I am Darcy Stone and today I'll be interviewing Private Douglas Grant. He served in World War I and ended up as a private in his unit. I join him now and I have some questions for him. Hi Douglas, how are you today? Hi Darcy, I'm very well thanks and it's good to be here. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Fine at all, ask away. What was it like before the war? Born in 1886 in North Queensland. I was raised in a traditional Aboriginal community in Burnham Kerr. My early family life was torn apart in 1887. This was when my parents and much of my Aboriginal community were killed in what was to believe a tribal fight. Lucky for me, I was rescued moments before my death by a scientist named Robert Grant. He was a Scottish immigrant serving in the region at the time. Although my original name was Pop and Jerry, he named me Douglas and raised me as his son. Wow, I'm so sorry to hear about your parents. Okay. What was it like to go to war and what did you experience? It's not a very nice place. Friends were suffering and poor hygiene made people have quite a lot of discomfort, so it wasn't pleasant at all. I managed to enlist in the 34th Battalion in January 1916. I was about to leave Australia, but I got discharged by the Aboriginal Protection Board intervened. They had regulations that prevented Aboriginals from leaving the country without government approval. It didn't bother me. In fact, I enlisted again, and that time I successfully embarked in the 13th Battalion in August, with government approval, of course. In 1917, when recruits were harder to find and one conscription referendum had already been lost, restrictions were cautiously eased. A new military order stated that half-castes may be enlisted in Australian force if examining medical officers were satisfied that the patients were from European origin. This was ridiculous and unbelievable. I was a full-blood Aboriginal, and this didn't affect me as I was already in the war. But still, that you can fight for your country without government approval. The whole half-breed thing is just uncalled for. No, but life can be unfair. You've just got to push through and keep trying, which is what I did, and eventually I got in. What were the conditions like? How were the trenches? The war were horrible. In fact, they caused quite a lot of death and poor hygiene. It was not pleasant at all. In the trenches, the conditions were awful. Rats were a problem. They ate all our food, and they wouldn't leave us alone while we were sleeping, which made us quite tired. Lice also caused a disease called trench fever. That made soldiers itch terribly and caused fever, headache, sore muscles, bones and joints. Since the trenches were exposed to rain and bad weather, it flooded quite often, making it boggy, muddy and even block our weapons. This made it hard to move in battle. The sustained exposure to the wet, muddy conditions caused trench foot, which sometimes would result in a foot being amputated. There were wooden floorboards which were put in place to help prevent trench foot, but it didn't work well. Cold weather was dangerous too. Soldiers often lose fingers or toes to frostbite. Some soldiers also died from exposure to the cold. Wow, that sounds horrible to live in. What is shell shock? Explain what it is to you. Shell shock is when you heard a ton of bombs or explosives go off quite close to you for a long period. That any noise will make you scared, flighty, unable to talk or walk properly, or even sleep correctly. This was the most common in the front line, as it was more prone for dangerous bombing than anywhere else. The number of shell shock cases grew during 1915 and 1916, but it remained poorly understood medically and psychologically. Point of view was that it was a result of hidden physical damage to the brain, with the shock waves from the bursting shells creating a cerebral lesion that caused symptoms that could potentially prove fatal later on in life, mainly after war if you survived. Another explanation was that shell shock resulted from poisoning in the carbon monoxide forms by the explosions, but who knows? Well, shell shock seems quite fatal. I'm lucky I didn't suffer it. At all throughout the war? I was wounded and captured on the 11th of April 1917 during the First Battle of Bulcott. I was held prisoner of war in a camp at Wittenberg and later at Windhof-Zoren near Berlin. I became an item of curiosity to German doctors, scientists, and anthropologists living competitive freedom. I was placed in charge of a camp of black prisoners, reinforcing the fact that, although a combat soldier, my captors saw me as different. Wow, that sounds terrible. What was prison camp like? I was a popular member of my battalion, so when I got caught, I had also impressed my German captors as a man of superior intelligence. Like I said in the other question, they saw me as different. My accomplishments included a wide knowledge of Shakespeare, poetry, and considerable skills as an artist and bagpipe player. My captors once told me I was nonetheless an exceptional man, which I am grateful for. Later in life, I suffered rejection and frustration because of my race, even with my acceptance of white culture. Question: how do you feel about Aboriginal veteran rights? I believe we were not treated the same. We served our country just like everyone else, yet we got nothing. However, I certainly do not expect something. It's just that we didn't even get recognised, let alone medals and other veteran assistances. I would have liked to be treated the same, that's all. People who come back from the war, white people, they got given land and other benefits like free medical. My people, we got nothing. That's appalling and unbelievable. You should be treated exactly the same. No, but it's different nowadays. So, when did you get repatriated? What did you do? Well, yes, I was repatriated to England in December 1918 and visited my foster parents, brother and relatives in Scotland. In April 1919, I headed for Australia after the demobilisation of the army on the 9th of July. I returned to work at Motstock. I was active in return servicemen affairs in this period and conducted a diggers session on the radio station. In the early 1930s, which by the time my foster parents and brother had died, I returned to Sydney. I worked as a clerk in the Cullen Park Mental Asylum and lived there, constructing in my spare time a large ornamental of a pond that spanned the replica of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. After World War II, I lived at the Salvation Army Old Men Quarters in Sydney. See your family again before moving back to Australia. Quite nice to see them once more, as they were the only family besides my real family that I had. Did you have any other interests before the war? I was into poetry and drawing while I was in school when I went to Scots College in Sydney. That was before the war. There I developed a love for Shakespeare and poetry, and my talent for drawing was encouraged. After I finished school, I pursued an interest in drawing, training as a medical draughtsman. Really good. Thank you. What type of thing you got up to after the war? In April 1917 to December 1918, I became the president of the British Help Committee, also known as the Red Cross, who you might have known today. While I was there, I organised food parcels and medical supplies for a large number of Indian and African prisoners held at the Hamburger prisoner of war camp for the coloured soldiers near Zoren, where I was. I wrote on behalf of my fellow prisoners to the embassies such as the British Help Committee, the Invalid Comfort Fund of Prisoner of War, the British Red Cross, and the Medical Simon's Help Society. That was a mouthful and a half. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thanks for joining me today. It was great to be here. Douglas Grant on 60 Minutes. Back to you in the studio, Amanda. Thank you, Darcy, for that wonderful interview with Douglas Grant. Now, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, so tune in tomorrow for more stories and reports.